Thanks for joining in. My name is Bray, and you and I are going to do some quote learning. So for the last month, I've been really fascinated by the podcast put out by Christianity Today called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. Mars Hill is a megachurch that was planted in the late 90s out in the Seattle area. And you could make the case that this was a very successful church. It depends on how you define success, of course. But if by success you mean that they had thousands of members in multiple campuses, then you could say it was a success. And undoubtedly, with any church of that size, you're going to be doing some tangible ministries that help people in tangible ways. There have been testimonies of men and women whose marriages were mended, to parents who began to take parenting very seriously, people who were on tough times being bought groceries and given a hand up. All of those things did happen with the Church of Mars Hill. What I find fascinating is that we have a group called Christianity Today who really had some liberal origins and has been kind of brought to us under the guise of orthodoxy. See, the people that get on the platforms earliest on tend to establish the most credibility. When I first became a believer, Christianity Today was one of the places that you would go for church news. So I followed Christianity Today over a decade ago just so that I could keep up with sort of current events in church news. But one thing that we don't tend to do, but I think is very important, is for us to see church history as starting and stopping within living memory. I've been following Mark Driscoll since I was a new believer. His most famous line, "Who in the blank do you think you are?" line that ended up lending him book deals and all kinds of national attention and millions of views on YouTube. That happened while I was a student in high school. And I heard the sermon clip because my youth pastor, who was doing some one-on-one discipleship with me, shared it with me and said, "This is probably something that you would like to avoid," to which I agreed. However, now the people that are telling us to avoid certain behaviors and certain styles of ministry, models of ministry, themselves have problematic styles and models of ministry. That is where this gets very tricky. But I believe that a discerning Christian like yourself can be able to delineate and keep up. What this means is you have one group that's not necessarily orthodox calling out another group that's not necessarily orthodox, and they are gaining a certain respectability by calling out this person over here. However, just because they called this person out over here on something that was clearly unorthodox, clearly outside of something that the majority of born-again believers are comfortable with, that does not mean that they have become more biblically sound. As you go through this podcast, you can't help but hear the echoes of language that comes from left-wing talking pieces. You can't help but hear in the voice of Mike Cosper, who is the narrator of this podcast, who does an exceptional job, who's got a great voice, who's no doubt a very intelligent man, but you cannot help but hear the Democrat left-leaning talking points that come from him when it comes to things on gender equality and roles inside of the church. He constantly talks about egalitarianism and props that up as if that is the way that we need to go forward. And that is not true. You can't take Driscoll's potential overcorrection of whatever cultural digressions we had towards egalitarianism and then say, okay, he went too far in complementarianism, to then take a position that is too far by being just generally egalitarian and say this is the right way. Neither one of these are helpful. And then in the linguistic culture that we live in today, you cannot take the talking points or the definitions of most of our Protestant leaders and use them to be helpful at all. You can't use the language of the Southern Baptist Convention former President J.D. Greer and the current President Ed Litton when they say that they're soft complementarians. You can't do that because, again, that comes with poison pills of their own. That can mean that they have females in as elders. That can mean that they elevate women's voices to a place of basically functioning in the position of a pastor. Maybe they don't necessarily have the title, but also it bolsters women into being co-pastors in some of these church plants. None of that is helpful. Again, we're playing ping pong, in which I love ping pong. Growing up in the church, ping pong was one of the things that we did at pastime before church, after church, and we had a great time doing it. So my wife is actually just as good as I am at ping pong, and it's very deceptive because she just does not look like she would be a whiz at ping pong. Table tennis to the people that we play with much more competitively, but she can really get after me when it comes to ping pong. With that being said, though, you have all of these differing sides, and none of them are hitting at the heart of Scripture. We must be careful. Just because one person is able to accurately call out somebody else for their error doesn't mean that their solutions are viable. And I'm just here to say that Mike Cosper and Christianity Today's solutions on this issue are not viable. Mike Cosper is very close with Ed Stetzer, and Ed Stetzer in those early years was very, very close to Mark Driscoll. And yet Mark Driscoll and the Ed Stetzer relationship gets a pass. Why? Because Ed Stetzer says the right things now, and he works for Christianity Today, which is where Mike Cosper works. Once you understand these connections, you realize that the level of integrity that you wish was taking place behind the scenes to do this quote-unquote long-form journalism may not actually be there. It may be that they themselves are like most other people, and they're pushing a story that they can also tie their narrative to and their causes to, which in my mind is moving egalitarianism into the mainstream, to the decline and the devastation of the biblical model for the family. That's my hot take on this podcast. I've enjoyed it. I'm listening to it. I have 15 minutes left of the last episode that's published. I look forward to listening to every episode that they put forward, but with the idea of knowing that just because they can accurately call out Driscoll's, problems does not mean that they're offering biblical solutions. So I would encourage you to watch it as well. It's put on very, very nicely. The quality is exceptional. I've enjoyed it. You will too. You're a discerning believer. You can watch this and you can say, there's what I need to avoid. There's what I need to avoid. And each of them could actually work to sharpen you to be a better and more effective believer. So the quote from today really is one from Phil Johnson. Phil Johnson basically said that they omitted the part where John MacArthur was calling out Driscoll in the beginning, because they have. They acted as if no church pastors were calling out Driscoll for all of the odd ways with which he was doing church, but I can also remember MacArthur being there saying, this is not how we want our men talking. This is not how we want our church leaders leading. This is not good. So, in the words of John MacArthur, if it looks like a heretic and it talks like a heretic, it's probably a heretic. My name is Bray. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.